The sun was setting over Sacramento as Eric Matthews drove home after a long day. The steady hum of his sedan and the soothing radio were a welcome contrast to the stress of his office. As he neared an intersection, the light turned yellow. He slowed, and just as the light turned red, he heard the whoop of sirens. He glanced in his rearview mirror and saw the flashing lights behind him. With a sigh, he pulled over. Out stepped Officer Jack Lawson, a man in his mid-30s with a buzz cut and an aura of authority. He approached Eric's car with purpose, his hand resting on his belt. "License and registration," Lawson said flatly. Eric complied, reaching for the papers. Lawson's eyes scanned them, and for a moment, Eric thought he saw something in the officer's gaze. A subtle change, something more than routine. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Lawson asked, voice curt. "I wasn't sure," Eric replied calmly. "I thought I made the light in time." Lawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued to look at Eric with suspicion. "You're not from around here, are you?" Lawson asked, glancing at Eric's license. "Moved here recently?" "Yes," Eric replied. "Just a few months ago. My address is on the license." Lawson studied him for a moment longer, his posture tense. "Where are you headed in such a hurry?" "Just home," Eric replied evenly. His calmness only seemed to aggravate Lawson, who now stood a little taller, as if sensing something off. Eric wasn't the typical driver Lawson expected to stop. There was something in his demeanor that set off alarms. The more Eric remained calm, the more Lawson's suspicion grew. Eric shifted in his seat. "Is there a specific reason you're asking?" "I told you to step out of the car," Lawson said suddenly, his voice a little sharper. Eric hesitated. "Is that really necessary?" "You got a problem with that?" Lawson's voice became an order. "Not at all," Eric replied. He opened the door and stepped out, his movements slow but deliberate. Lawson's eyes tracked him carefully, his hand hovering near his gun. The tension was palpable. "Hands where I can see them," Lawson instructed. Eric obeyed, placing his hands visible on the car. He glanced at Lawson, waiting for the next move. "Is there something you're looking for, officer?" Eric asked, his tone neutral. Lawson didn't answer immediately. He circled Eric, keeping his eyes trained on him. "You're awfully calm," Lawson remarked, almost accusingly. "I don't think that's unusual," Eric replied. "Is there something wrong with being calm?" Lawson's gaze hardened. "You know what's wrong with it," he snapped. "You're acting like you know exactly how this works." "I'm just trying to understand why you've pulled me over," Eric said. "Is it for speeding? Running the red light?" Lawson narrowed his eyes. "You seem a little too sure of yourself, too confident for someone caught breaking the law." "I'm not breaking the law," Eric said calmly. "I'm just following your instructions." Lawson's lips curled into a tight smile. "Yeah? Well, maybe you should start explaining yourself before things get more complicated." Eric's calmness unsettled him. Lawson leaned closer, his voice dropping lower. "I think you're hiding something. You don't just stay that calm when you're guilty." Eric's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "I'm not guilty of anything, officer. I'm just asking for clarity. Why am I here?" The pause between them stretched. Lawson seemed to be weighing his next words carefully. Finally, he took a step back, clearly flustered, but his hand didn't move far from his holster. "I asked you to step out. Now I'm asking you to cooperate," Lawson said, attempting to regain control. Eric watched him, steady in his gaze. "Cooperate with what?" Lawson stepped back, folding his arms over his chest. He gave Eric another long look before speaking again, his voice a little lower now. "You don't get it. This is how it works. I'm the officer here. You don't question me." Eric's eyes met Lawson's. He didn't break the stare. "I'm not questioning your authority, officer. I'm questioning your methods. This isn't how it should work." The silence hung in the air before Eric spoke again. What's the most troubling thing here? Lawson looked at him, his posture tense. What? The fact that you assumed I wouldn't know my rights. That's the issue, Eric said. His voice remained even, but there was a growing intensity in his words. That's what's troubling. Lawson blinked, confused for a moment, and then his expression hardened. He took a step back, straightening his uniform. You think you know everything? You think you're smarter than me? Eric shook his head. I just know what's right. Lawson's hand tightened around his belt as he looked at Eric, then back down at the ground. He didn't speak for several moments, clearly wrestling with himself. Eric stood still, his demeanor calm. His pulse was steady. It was clear that Lawson was out of his depth. He was used to exerting control. But with Eric, the officer found himself on shaky ground. I think you need to understand who you're talking to, Eric said. His words cut through the tension like a knife. I'm not just anyone. Lawson tilted his head, unsure of where this conversation was heading. What's that supposed to mean? Eric reached into his jacket pocket. I'm Eric Matthews, head of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Division. He opened his wallet and flashed his badge at Lawson. Lawson's eyes widened in disbelief. He stumbled back, his voice catching in his throat. Internal Affairs? Eric nodded, his face stoic. I investigate officers like you. This entire exchange, the way you've treated me, is exactly the kind of behavior I'm here to address. For a moment, Lawson was speechless. He stared at the badge, then at Eric, before his hands started to tremble. I didn't know, Lawson stammered. Eric shook his head. Clearly. With a deep breath, Eric straightened up, his gaze not leaving Lawson's. You've broken protocol, officer. That's the truth. It doesn't matter who I am. It's about what you did, and that needs to be addressed. Lawson's face flushed, his expression pained. He reached for Eric's registration and driver's license from his chest pocket, his hands shaking as he handed them back. Eric took them without a word and returned to his car. He slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away, leaving Lawson standing in the middle of the street, disoriented and uncertain. The next morning, Eric sat at his desk, reviewing the case file on Officer Lawson. A few complaints, mostly minor. But this wasn't just a minor incident. It was indicative of larger issues within the department. Mr. Matthews? Linda, his assistant, knocked on the door. The chief wants to see you. Something about last night's stop. Eric nodded. I'll be there soon. Later, in the chief's office, Eric laid out his concerns. We can't just sweep this under the rug. It's bigger than Lawson. It's about how the department operates. We need to take action, or this keeps happening. Chief Daniels sighed, rubbing his temples. You're right, but it's not going to be easy. We can start by reviewing the department's training and accountability systems, Eric suggested. We can't afford to let this kind of behavior slide. Daniels looked at him, his expression hardened. I'll support you on this, but you need to make it clear to everyone that this is non-negotiable. Eric's work over the following weeks was tireless. He led interviews, reviewed protocols, and pushed for transparency. It wasn't long before the department-wide review began, addressing issues like racial profiling, excessive force, and unprofessional behavior. Lawson faced an internal hearing, resulting in a suspension. Eric knew it was only one step, but it was progress. A month later, Eric stood before a gathering of officers and community leaders at a town hall. Accountability isn't just about punishing bad behavior. It's about ensuring that everyone in this department upholds the values we've sworn to protect, he said, his voice steady. The room fell silent as Eric's words resonated. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of accomplishment. This was only the beginning, but change was on the horizon.